A skeleton wired to a cactus in the middle of the desert. A hiker who vanished without a sound, leaving behind only one haunting photograph of a storm-torn sky. And a man who once helped search for him, only to later become the prime suspect and disappear himself. This is not a tale of someone simply lost in the wild. This is a story of a calculated predator who turned one of the harshest landscapes in America into his hunting ground. What kind of person would commit such a brutal crime? And how could someone vanish so completely, even while under nationwide pursuit? If you want to uncover the disturbing truth behind these questions, like this video and subscribe to Unscripted Tales, where we delve into real stories that blur the line between reality and nightmare. It all began in March of 2020, when 36-year-old Ethan Miller, an experienced hiker known for his love of solitude, embarked on a solo trek into the unforgiving expanse of the Chihuahuan Desert in New Mexico. For Ethan, this was nothing new. He thrived in remote, isolated terrains, finding peace where most would find only danger. His family trusted his skill and experience. On the day he entered the desert, Ethan sent his last message to a close friend. Along with it came a haunting photograph, dark thunderclouds swirling over the jagged Mesa del Sol plateau, the land bathed in a dim and unsettling glow. It was beautiful and ominous, a snapshot of the wild places he loved most. But after that, there was silence. Hours turned to days, and his phone remained unanswered. When Ethan failed to return home as scheduled, his family's unease erupted into panic. Authorities were contacted, and a search effort was launched. Local sheriffs, search and rescue teams, and volunteers swept the desert with helicopters circling overhead, scanning for any sign of him. The landscape was dissected square by square, but no footprints, no campsite, not even discarded gear appeared. Ethan had simply vanished, leaving only his last image of a storm-laden sky behind. The desert did not give up its secrets easily. As the first search teams entered the Chihuahuan wilderness, they were met with the harsh reality of the land Ethan Miller had loved so much. Heat waves shimmered above the sand. The winds carried dust across endless stretches of rock and thorn. It was a place where the sun beat down without mercy and shadows disappeared before noon. But they searched anyway. Deputies, volunteers, park rangers, and even helicopter crews joined forces. They started at the Mesa del Sol plateau, the last known point from Ethan's final photo. They expanded outward from there, using grid patterns, hoping to find any trace. A footprint. A scrap of clothing. A water bottle. Anything. But there was nothing. The rescue teams moved methodically, checking ravines, dry washes, and the bases of cliffs. Dogs were brought in. Drones scanned from above. Each day ended the same way it began, with no sign of Ethan. It was as if he had been swallowed by the desert itself. His friends joined the effort, camping out in the dry heat, refusing to give up. His family held on to hope, clinging to the idea that maybe he was still alive. Maybe he had gotten lost. Maybe he was injured and waiting for someone to find him. But as the days turned into weeks, that hope began to fade. There were no calls. No bank activity. No movement from his phone. Nothing to hold on to but silence and that one eerie photo of the stormy plateau. Eventually, the active search was called off. The official word was that Ethan Miller was missing. Unresolved. Unfound. His case remained open, but the desert had gone quiet again. And everyone who had looked for him was forced to return home, empty-handed. No one realized then that they had been walking within miles of a hidden horror. That someone may have been watching their efforts, calm and composed, knowing all along that the truth was buried right there among the cactus and stone. But then, 3 years later, the desert finally whispered back. What did a group of scientists stumble upon during a simple wildlife survey that would turn a missing person case into something far more terrifying? It was the summer of 2023 when the silence of the desert finally broke. A team of wildlife researchers had traveled deep into an isolated corner of the Chihuahuan Desert. Their mission was simple, study the bobcat population in areas far removed from tourist paths. This was a part of the desert few ever saw. Old rocky outcrops jutted upward like jagged teeth, and towering ocotillo cacti stood frozen like ancient guards watching over the barren land. One of the researchers scanned the horizon through binoculars. At first, it was nothing but sand, stone, and cactus. But then something unusual caught his eye. A shape that did not belong. It was fixed against the trunk of a massive ocotillo cactus, far in the distance. Curious, the team moved closer. Step by step, their curiosity shifted to unease. And then unease gave way to horror. There, at the base of the cactus, was a human skeleton. The bones were tightly bound to the cactus with rusted wire. The skeleton was twisted in an unnatural position, as if the person had struggled in their final moments. The sight was haunting. Time and heat had stripped away everything but bone, but the traces of a slow and terrible death were still there. Fine scratches marked the surface, likely from scavenging animals. Some bones bore signs of burns from relentless sun exposure. Scattered in the sand nearby were fragments of what seemed to be a charred portable stove handle and torn pieces of a military-style belt. The researchers froze, barely able to comprehend what they were seeing. Then they radioed for help. Within hours, local sheriffs and forensic teams arrived. The entire area was secured. The skeletal remains were carefully collected. Every scrap of evidence around that cactus was photographed, bagged, and labeled. There was no question, this was not a natural death. The remains were sent for DNA testing. Days later, the result came back. It was Ethan Miller. For 3 years, he had been missing. Now he had been found, in the most brutal way imaginable. And when the cause of death was confirmed, the truth became undeniable. Ethan had been alive when he was tied to that cactus. The heat and dehydration had done the rest. This was no accident. It was murder. What they would soon uncover next would reveal just how carefully this nightmare had been planned. The forensic lab confirmed what everyone had feared. The DNA matched perfectly. The skeleton in the desert was indeed Ethan Miller. His family, who had lived in painful uncertainty for 3 long years, now faced a truth far worse than they ever imagined. The medical examiner's report painted a chilling picture. There were no fractures or wounds on the bones that would indicate a sudden or violent attack. There were no signs of gunshots or blunt force trauma. Ethan had been fully conscious when he was tied to that cactus. His death came slowly, caused by dehydration, relentless sun exposure, and unbearable heat. It was a deliberate act of cruelty. Someone had chosen to bind him there, leave him under the scorching desert sun, and walk away knowing exactly what would happen. Investigators returned to the scene with fresh determination. They combed the surrounding area for anything that had been missed. And slowly, more fragments of Ethan's final days emerged from the sand. A torn piece of fabric believed to be from his tent was found tangled in dry brush. A ripped and weathered backpack lay half buried in the dust. An empty water bottle rested under a rock ledge as if discarded in desperation. Each discovery confirmed what they already knew. Ethan had been deep in that area, far from any marked trails, when his killer struck. But one piece of evidence stood out more than the rest, the remnants of a military-style belt with a partially preserved metal buckle. It was the kind of gear often used by soldiers or outdoor survivalists. That single clue changed the direction of the investigation. Detectives began to consider that whoever killed Ethan might have a background in survival training or military knowledge. This was not the work of an amateur. It was someone who understood the desert, knew how to move unseen, and had prepared carefully for this. It was at this point that investigators started asking a haunting question. Who in Ethan's life, or perhaps outside it, would have had the knowledge and skill to pull off something like this? What they were about to discover would lead them to a name that was far closer to the original search effort than anyone had ever expected. With the discovery of Ethan Miller's remains, the investigation shifted into overdrive. Detectives dug into his life, searching for anyone who might have had a reason to harm him. Friends, colleagues, and even distant acquaintances were interviewed one by one. Yet nothing linked Ethan to anyone dangerous. He had no enemies, no disputes, no debts. He was simply a man who loved the wilderness. The military-style belt found near the skeleton became the center of attention. Investigators began tracking stores that sold similar gear and checked records at local military bases. They wanted to know if anyone with survival training had been in the area around the time Ethan vanished. But the answer came from somewhere far more unexpected. During their review, detectives revisited all the names connected to the original 2020 search effort. Among the volunteers was a man named Daniel Cross. He had been one of the most active participants, guiding teams through rugged terrain and speaking confidently about the desert. Many remembered him as helpful and knowledgeable. But when his past was examined, everything changed. Daniel Cross had a criminal record. Years earlier, he had been convicted of kidnapping. He had served time and been released on parole, blending quietly back into society. The details of his case were disturbing. It involved isolating a victim in a remote location and holding them captive for days before they managed to escape. This revelation sent a shockwave through the investigation. Detectives quickly moved to locate Daniel for questioning. But when they arrived at his house, they found something chilling. His home was empty. Furniture was there, personal belongings were scattered neatly in place, but Daniel himself was gone. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. And then came another discovery that made their blood run cold. Neighbors reported that Daniel disappeared shortly before Ethan's skeleton was found. It was no coincidence. The name Daniel Cross now sat firmly at the center of the case. But who exactly was this man? And what investigators would soon uncover inside his abandoned house would turn suspicion into undeniable proof. Detectives secured a warrant and entered Daniel Cross's home. From the moment they stepped inside, they felt an unsettling chill. The house was painfully bare. There were no family photos, no personal decorations, and nothing to suggest warmth or comfort. It was a place that felt more like a temporary hideout than a home. In his study, they found something that changed everything. Spread out across the desk were detailed topographical maps of the Chihuahuan Desert. Several areas were marked in pencil, but one in particular was circled in bold red ink. It was the exact location where Ethan Miller's skeleton had been found. Next to the maps were books. Survival manuals for extreme conditions. Guides about the desert's flora and fauna, with several pages bookmarked on plants like the Ocotillo cactus. And then, one book stood out, an old, worn guide on knots and bindings. A page describing how to secure wire had its corner folded over as if someone had studied it closely. In the garage, detectives found even more. Tools were arranged in perfect order, including a set of wire cutters. Forensic experts compared the tool marks and confirmed that they matched the cuts on the wire used to bind Ethan's remains. There was also an empty portable stove fuel canister identical to the one linked to the crime scene. And then, hanging on a nail, they saw it. An old military-style belt, missing its buckle. Piece by piece, the evidence formed a chilling picture. Daniel Cross had not only planned this, he had prepared meticulously. He studied the desert, practiced the tools he would use, and mapped out the exact location where he would leave his victim. And there was something even more disturbing. Forensic analysts discovered that Daniel's computer had been professionally wiped clean. But traces showed that it had once held significant amounts of data. It was clear that he had gone to great lengths to erase his digital footprint. Daniel Cross was no longer just a suspect. He was now the undeniable focus of the investigation. Yet as detectives built their case, one unsettling question remained: if this man was so calculated, how had he managed to insert himself into the original search effort for Ethan, all while knowing what he had done? The answer lay in the chilling testimonies of those who remembered him during those desperate days. As investigators dug deeper into Daniel Cross's life, they uncovered a disturbing pattern that tied him even closer to the crime. They interviewed neighbors, volunteers from the original search for Ethan Miller, and anyone who had ever interacted with him. Neighbors described him as a loner. He rarely spoke, never hosted visitors, and often drove away in his old pickup truck for days at a time without explanation. He kept to himself, living behind high fences and drawn curtains. But the most chilling testimonies came from the volunteers who had searched for Ethan back in 2020. Many remembered Daniel vividly. He had seemed confident and knowledgeable about the desert. He gave practical advice and even directed teams where to look. People trusted him. They followed his instructions without question. One volunteer recalled something unsettling. Daniel had insisted repeatedly that the search teams focus on the northern region of the desert. He claimed it was the most logical path a lost hiker would take. Everyone believed him. But Ethan's remains were found in the southern region, far from where Daniel had pushed them to look. This was no coincidence. Daniel had stood there, among grieving friends and family, pretending to help while deliberately steering them away from the truth. He had watched the search parties pass through the desert, knowing full well that Ethan was tied to a cactus only a few miles away. Investigators also reviewed Daniel's old criminal file. Years before, he had kidnapped a young woman and held her captive in a remote cabin for several days before she escaped. There was no ransom demand. No clear motive. Psychologists who evaluated him at the time said his crime stemmed from a twisted desire for control, to feed on fear and helplessness. Now it seemed that desire had escalated into something far darker. He was no longer content with holding someone captive. He wanted to kill. And he wanted his victim to suffer slowly. The image of Daniel Cross shifted from a quiet recluse to something far more terrifying, a predator who had patiently stalked the desert, waiting for the perfect target. But one question still haunted the investigators. Why Ethan Miller? There was no known connection between the two men, no shared history. The truth behind how Daniel chose his victim was about to reveal something even more disturbing. As investigators pressed forward, they uncovered a chilling truth. Ethan Miller and Daniel Cross had never met before that day in the desert. There was no shared history, no disputes, no personal motive. It became clear that Ethan was not chosen for who he was, but rather for what he represented. A lone traveler. Far from help. Perfect prey. Detectives pieced together Daniel's past behavior. He had a known pattern of vanishing into remote places for days at a time. Witnesses recalled seeing his old pickup truck parked near isolated trails. Some hikers reported feeling uneasy after seeing him alone in the wilderness, but no one ever imagined how dangerous he truly was. Experts examined his prior kidnapping case and noticed disturbing similarities. Just like before, Daniel seemed obsessed with isolation and control. But this time, he had taken it even further. The desert, with its brutal sun and silence, became his weapon. Psychological profiles painted him as a calculated predator. He likely watched Ethan from a distance, studying him for the right moment. Ethan's love of solitude, his habit of hiking in unpopulated areas, and his predictable patterns made him an ideal target. For investigators, this was terrifying. It meant that Daniel's victim was random. If it had not been Ethan, it could have been anyone who crossed his path alone in that desert. He did not need a reason. He hunted for the act itself. This theory explained his confidence during the search in 2020. He knew nobody would connect them. He could walk among the searchers, mislead them, and enjoy the knowledge that his crime was hidden right under their feet. The reality was chilling. Daniel Cross had chosen the desert not just as a hiding place, but as his hunting ground. And if he had not been caught, there was no telling who else could have vanished in the same way. With this understanding, authorities launched a nationwide manhunt. Daniel Cross was no longer just a suspect. He was a predator on the run. But his disappearance was just as baffling as his crime. When they began tracking him, it became clear that Daniel had planned his escape with the same precision as his murder. The manhunt for Daniel Cross spread across state lines. His face was on television screens, news articles, and wanted posters in police stations. Border Patrol units were alerted. Yet despite the massive search, there was no trace of him. His old pickup truck was gone, no sightings, no transactions. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. Investigators dug deeper into his old case, hoping to learn more about the mind they were chasing. The kidnapping years earlier was eerily similar to Ethan's murder. He had taken a young woman into a forested area, far from civilization, and held her captive in an abandoned cabin. There were no demands for ransom, no signs of assault. It was as if the act of holding someone powerless was his only purpose. Psychologists who had once evaluated him described Daniel Cross as someone who craved dominance and control. He was not driven by revenge or anger. His crimes were methodical and detached. He enjoyed watching his victims break under fear and helplessness. This profile matched perfectly with what happened to Ethan Miller. Only this time, Daniel had escalated. He no longer wanted to simply control his victim. He wanted to prolong his suffering and then watch nature itself finish the job. Detectives theorized that Ethan had been chosen at random. Daniel likely scouted hiking trails and remote desert routes, looking for someone alone. Ethan's passion for solitude made him a target without even knowing it. Daniel would have followed him from a distance, waited for the right moment, and then struck with precision. The desert was the perfect stage for his twisted desires. No witnesses. No easy escape. No chance of survival once bound under the scorching sun. This terrifying realization changed the investigation's tone. Daniel was not hiding out of fear. He was hiding because he wanted to. He had studied how to survive off the grid. He knew how to disappear and live unseen. But then, a small breakthrough came from a place nobody expected. A clue buried deep in the remnants of his erased digital life gave investigators their first real lead in months. Cyber experts spent months working on Daniel Cross's wiped computer. Bit by bit, they recovered fragments of data that had been buried deep within the machine. Most of it was useless, but then they uncovered a small cache of browser history that changed everything. The recovered searches showed Daniel researching abandoned mining towns and isolated hunting cabins across several states. His focus was on remote areas near the mountains on the border of Utah, places few people ever ventured. He had also searched for ways to survive with minimal supplies and how to evade thermal imaging detection. It became clear. Daniel was not just running. He was preparing for a life completely off the grid. He wanted to disappear into places so remote that even law enforcement would not think to look. Armed with this information, authorities redirected their search. Federal marshals and sheriff's departments began combing through abandoned properties, old cabins, and forgotten settlements in rugged terrain. Teams hiked through dense forests, crossed rocky slopes, and checked structures that had not been touched in decades. The work was exhausting and dangerous. Many of the cabins were barely standing, some accessible only by long treks or off-road vehicles. Weeks passed. Then months. Still, nothing. Daniel seemed to stay one step ahead, vanishing into the wilderness as if he had melted into it. Meanwhile, his case loomed over the public like a shadow. Stories of the skeleton bound to a cactus spread fear throughout the region. People wondered if he was still out there, watching, waiting, ready to strike again. Just when it seemed the search would never end, a call came in from a remote county in Utah. A local game warden reported something strange. An abandoned miner's cabin deep in the forest, boarded up for decades, now showed signs of life. The windows had been sealed from the inside. A faint trail of smoke drifted from a rusted chimney. The marshals prepared to move in. What they would find inside that cabin would finally bring this nightmare to an end. The tip from the game warden was exactly what investigators needed. A team of marshals moved swiftly, trekking through rugged forest trails to reach the remote cabin. The air was heavy with tension as they approached. This cabin had been abandoned for decades, yet it showed unmistakable signs of recent use. They surrounded it quietly, taking cover behind trees and rocks. From a distance, they could see the faint plume of smoke rising from the chimney. No one inside had made a sound. Through loudspeakers, they called out Daniel Cross's name, ordering him to surrender. The forest fell silent. No movement. No reply. Hours passed as they waited, keeping their eyes fixed on the boarded windows. Finally, the decision was made. A tactical team stormed the cabin. They broke the door open and rushed inside, weapons ready. But there was no fight waiting for them. Daniel Cross was sitting motionless on a rough wooden bed. He was dead. A pistol lay on the floor near his hand. The smell of gunpowder hung in the air. He had taken his own life, likely just hours before the team arrived. The interior of the cabin was stripped down to essentials. A few cans of food. A supply of water. Tools neatly arranged. Maps of the region pinned to the walls. It was the perfect hideout for a man who wanted to disappear completely. But then investigators noticed something else. On a small wooden table beside the bed was a single Polaroid photograph. It showed an Ocotillo cactus standing tall beneath a stormy sky. It was almost identical to the last photograph Ethan Miller had sent to his friend before vanishing. It was a trophy. A silent confession left behind by a killer who had no intention of explaining himself. With Daniel's death, the manhunt was over. But one lingering question remained. What could drive someone to commit such a calculated and cruel act, and then vanish into isolation, leaving no answers behind? Forensic teams worked carefully inside the cabin. Every inch was examined, every object documented. The confirmation came quickly. The fingerprints, dental records, and ballistic analysis left no doubt. The man dead on that bed was Daniel Cross. His gun was traced back to a legal purchase he had made years earlier. There was no sign of struggle, no evidence of anyone else present. This was a solitary end for a man who had spent his final months hiding from the world in silence. Investigators searched for any kind of explanation. A journal. A note. A letter. Anything that might reveal why he had done it. But there was nothing. No written words. No confession beyond that one eerie photograph of the cactus under a storm-darkened sky. The photograph was studied closely. It matched Ethan Miller's last known location perfectly. It was clear that Daniel had taken it himself, almost as if he had returned to that spot to capture his own twisted memory of the crime. It was the closest thing to an admission he had left behind. The rest of the cabin reflected his calculated nature. He had prepared for the long term, carefully rationed food, fresh water containers, tools for repairs, and hand-marked maps of isolated routes through forests and mountain passes. It was clear he had intended to live out his days in hiding, avoiding civilization entirely. But when he realized he was cornered, he chose death over capture. For Ethan's family, it brought a bitter closure. They had answers, but no justice. There would be no trial, no chance to confront the man who had taken their loved one. Daniel Cross had taken the truth with him into death, leaving only fear and questions behind. Even after the case was officially closed, the photograph on that table stayed burned into the minds of everyone who saw it. It was a reminder of how one man had turned an empty desert into his personal hunting ground, and how he managed to walk among those who searched for his victim without anyone suspecting a thing. The silence of the desert remained, unchanged, holding on to its secrets. And the haunting question lingered in the minds of all who knew the story. What darkness drives a person to commit such a crime and vanish into the wild as if they were never there at all? With Daniel Cross confirmed dead, the long and painful hunt came to its end. For Ethan Miller's family, the news was a mixture of relief and heartbreak. They finally had answers. They knew what had happened, and they knew who was responsible. But there would be no trial, no chance to see justice carried out in a courtroom. The man who caused so much pain had silenced himself forever. Investigators presented their findings. The photograph of the cactus became the defining piece of evidence, a final, haunting message left by Daniel. It was clear he had returned to the site of his crime, taking that image as a trophy of his twisted victory. He wanted to remember it. He wanted to relive it. That was the only confession he ever gave. Experts agreed on one thing. Daniel Cross was not driven by anger or revenge. He was not targeting Ethan specifically. He was a predator who hunted those who were alone, those who would not be found easily. The desert gave him exactly what he wanted. Isolation, silence, and control. Ethan Miller was a man who loved solitude, and tragically, that love placed him directly in the path of a killer who thrived on it. The search through Daniel's past confirmed this was not a crime of passion or impulse. It was a calculated act by a man who had studied survival, erased his tracks, and prepared for years to disappear. His plan only unraveled when investigators uncovered his digital footprints and tracked him to his lonely hideout in Utah. Ethan's family held a memorial at the edge of the desert he once loved. Friends gathered under the same wide, endless sky he had photographed in his final message. They spoke about his adventurous spirit, his calm nature, and his love for places untouched by human hands. For them, it was not just the end of a case, it was the closing of a chapter that had haunted them for 3 long years. The desert remains the same, silent and indifferent, as it has for centuries. Somewhere among its jagged rocks and sun-baked sands, echoes of this story remain. A man who walked into the wild for peace. Another who followed for darkness. And a final, haunting image of a cactus beneath a stormy sky, now forever tied to a crime that shook everyone who heard it. If you are still watching this story, it means this story deserves your like and subscribe. Please help us reach 5,000 likes on this video. It is totally free and it helps us share more chilling true stories just like this. Tell us in the comments from which city you are watching this story, and let us know your thoughts on this haunting case.